Welcome back, everyone. It is Eric from Rare Candy, and today's the day we finally have our full look at the new Scarlet EX and Violet EX sets that are dropping in Japan next week, which of course eventually will be combined into our full Scarlet and Violet set a few months down the road as well. Now, when we're looking at these cards today, we do have to sort of keep in mind, and I'm going to do my best as well, that these are going to be for the upcoming post-rotation format. So we sort of need to filter these cards through the lens of knowing that cards like Quick Ball, Metal Saucer, Crobat V, etc. are no longer going to be in the format. And that definitely does impact how good these cards are actually going to be. And also too, guys, I just want to give you guys a quick shout out for being so patient with me. I know throughout December, I really didn't upload a whole lot, but to be honest, I've just been really burnt out on the Silver Tempest format. And I also made a post towards the end of the month too. I had a pet pass away, which also sort of just really made me not in the mood, or really just my heart wasn't in content creation there for a little bit. So I appreciate you guys being patient with me. I knew once Scarlet and Violet news started to drop, I would be a lot more motivated. Here I am, of course. So again, guys, just thanks for bearing with me through December while it was a bit of a slower month. But with that being said, guys, I'm gonna stop rambling. I appreciate you guys holding with me here through this intro. Just be sure to smack that like button to feed that YouTube algorithm, and let's jump in and check out the brand new Scarlet and Violet cards. Okay, we have Arboliva, still not sure how you pronounce this Pokemon, but has some ability. It says when you play this Pokemon from hand to evolve one of your Pokemon during your turn, you may heal all damage from one of your Pokemon. Now, if I'm not mistaken, I think there's already a card like this in the format. I could be misremembering, but I'm pretty sure there is another Grass Stage 2 that does this. Feel free to correct me if you guys think I'm wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure there is something like this, which of course is not an effect that we've seen be successful in a long time. The last time I really remember a card like this being good was during the XY era. There was a Primal Groudon deck that played a Dragonite, like a Stage 2 Dragonite that did, I'm pretty sure, this same thing. And that was the last time I remember a card like this seeing any play at all. So probably not going to be that good in the short term if I just had to guess, but especially since we do have Cheryl still in the format, but we are losing some healing cards like Hyper Potion. Something to keep in mind, but I don't have a lot of high hopes for this card. Okay, next up we have Armarouge, and I'm actually kind of excited, not for this, but because I feel like this gives us a chance that there is a Cerulege in the set as well, which has me excited. I think Cerulege is one of the only good Pokemon that we saw in Scarlet and Violet. Feel free to chew me out if you disagree, but I'm excited for Cerulege in the TCG. Really hoping we get some decent cards for it. But for Armarouge, let's take a look at this thing. The attack is pretty bad, but the ability is kind of interesting. As often as you like during your turn, you move a fire energy from one of your bench Pokemon to your active. My issue is that with Magma Basin, we can already just put the energy where we want. But I guess with this, you can make the argument that, yes, you can Magma Basin onto the bench if you don't have a switching card. You can then just move this energy back up to your active and not have to worry about a lot of switching mechanics and stuff like that. And it does allow you to get around the 2 damage counters that Magma Basin would normally give you. But is that worth running a Stage 1? I don't think so, guys. I would almost rather just play more switch cards instead of running a Stage 1 like this. Now, the other upside to this card that I can see is that it doesn't specify basic fire energy, so that means if we do get something like a Rainbow Energy reprint or an Aurora Energy reprint, we will actually be able to move special energies that can provide fire as well. So that is something we do have to keep in mind. Is that going to come up in the short term? I'm not so sure. But, going forward, it's just something to keep in the back of our mind. But cards, nothing special for the moment. Okay, next up we have a new Terrastal Pokemon. So we saw Arcanine previously. I'm pretty sure that was the only one we'd seen up until this point, but we have Gyarados now. And the Terrastal effect says, this Pokemon doesn't take any damage from attacks while on the bench. This is like everyone's worst fear come true, because like we saw Arcanine, we saw the Terrastal effect that had, and everyone was kind of like, yeah, it's nice that it has this, but this is so mechanically uninteresting. Like the whole thing with the Terrastal Pokemon in the games is that it grants them an additional typing. Sometimes it's one they wouldn't otherwise have. And so we all kind of expected this Terrastal mechanic to be something that tied into energy in some way. Like there's so many things they could have done with just energy based effects. But even still, like the other hope was that, okay, well maybe like maybe each type in the game has its own unique terrestrial effect. Like fire Pokemon have their own terrestrial effect, water Pokemon have their own. Not the case. The only little bit of hopium that I can see at this point is that Arcanine and Gyarados are both stage 1 Pokemon. So maybe basic Pokemon and stage 2 Pokemon have their own unique terrestrial effect as well. That's the only thing I can really see that would still make the terrestrial mechanic in the TCG interesting. Or we could even see like other cards, like maybe some sort of tool or special energy out there that ties into terrestrial Pokemon in some way. For the moment, this is a huge letdown. Definitely curious your guys' thoughts on the terrestrial mechanic. Definitely feel free to sound off what you think about this. But looking at Gyarados specifically though, 3 water for 100, awful, and 3 water, 2 colors, 180. If your opponent's active already has any damage counters, does 180 more. Okay. So, I mean, that's a ton of damage. We're one-shotting like literally anything that gets in our path. But there's like no way to power this thing up because we're losing Frostmoth in the rotation. Arceus can't accelerate to this since it's not a V. Melody can't accelerate to this. The only thing I can think of that we have is going to be like Kingler V and VMAX, or there's the Frost Last that can accelerate a single water energy out of discard, or maybe Mirage Gate. I guess you could use Mirage Gate, but yeah, this thing seems like near impossible to get set up, so probably not going to be that good. Okay, so we have a Milling Wug Trio. I'll at least throw out there. You flip 3 coins for each heads, discard the top 3 cards of your opponent's deck. So, if you flip 3 heads, which is definitely going to be tougher since we are losing Glimwood Tangle, you can discard 9, which is pretty impressive. But again, the first issue, we're a coin flip attack. That's already pretty awful. On average, you're going to hit 1 to 2 heads. I mean, 2 heads is still 6. That's pretty good. The other issue with this card is that it has a 3 energy attack cost. I mean, yes, there are ways at cheating extra energy on this, especially since this is just colorless energy. But if we just compare this to something like Durant, which is a basic Pokemon and only attacks for 2 energy, you have so much additional deck space to work with at a pretty minor cost, since Durant's going to be milling 3 to 4 cards every turn on average. So I don't think Wug Trio is particularly great, but you know, it's kind of a fun card. I'm sure will be the we'll make it into some meme deck videos on like PTCGO or PTCG Live. So there's that, if at least. Okay, next up we have Dodonzo and Tatsugiri. We do have to kind of talk about these cards together because Dodonzo has this attack that does 50 for each Tatsugiri in your discard pile, which makes sense. You know, I was definitely excited to see how they were going to handle these Pokemon, since in the games they do like synergize well together. And this attack really isn't that bad for just a single double turbo. If you have all 4 Tatsugiri in discard pile, you can hit for 180 after you account for the DTE reduction, which really isn't that bad, guys. But I don't think that's still good enough to be competitive. Like, I think this deck actually can get set up pretty well. You know, you have heavy balls to search Tatsugiris out of the prizes so you don't prize them. We can pitch them away with research and Ultra Ball. But even just a steady 180 as early as like turn 2 doesn't seem like a game-winning strategy, I have to say. I think you really would need something else that could help you take like a big one-shot maybe at some point in the game. You can probably win some games with this. It just probably is at a power level just below what some of the other like big decks are going to be able to do. And then Tatsugiri, let's see, search your deck for up to 2 basic water energy, attach them to one of your basic Pokemon. Okay, so I mean, I guess we can power up our Gyarados EX with this, though I really don't want 2 damage counters on a Magikarp. That would feel awful. And then, I mean, beyond that, there's really not a whole lot to do with this. I guess you could power up Dodonzo, but more than likely, you're just running, well, I guess you probably run your 4 DTE and then like maybe like 6 water energy. That way you can lead the game with this and have, you know, at least 1 Dodonzo not reliant on DTE. So that actually seems kind of okay. And then its other attack, 30 for water, put this Pokemon, all cards attached into your hand. So card's okay. I'm definitely curious to see what other Dodonzos and Tatsugiris that we see throughout the course of these Scarlet and Violet cards, because I'm sure we will see more of these cards like synergize well together in the future. But these first two, they're okay, just nothing too crazy. Okay, so we have Gardevoir EX, which I'm sure a lot of you guys are already pretty familiar with. I have to say, it's probably one of the best Scarlet and Violet cards we've seen so far, so definitely curious to see if we have anything else today that kind of rivals this sort of power level. But let's do a recap on this thing. As often as you like during your turn, you may attach a basic Psychic from discard to one of your Psychic Pokemon. If you do, put 2 damage counters on this Pokemon, but you can't use the ability if the 2 damage counters would knock them out. And then for 2 Psychic and a Colorless is 190, heal any special conditions on this Pokemon. So funny enough, when I first read this card, I didn't think much of it until I realized it says, as often as you like during your turn. So we can use this 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times, however much we want in a given turn, which is pretty cool because we do still have Cheryl in the format, which has me excited for this card's possibilities. So we can pair this, you know, with things like Shadow Rider if we want. We can run just a Gardevoir EX deck if we want to. You know, we get swung on, heal off all the damage, then re-accelerate the energy with this thing, and hopefully keep ourselves still out of one-shot range for the next turn. But I think one of the things that makes this card so good is just the insane evolution line that it has. Like, we have the Water Duplicate style Kirlia, we have the Trade Kirlia, we have the Gallade that can search for supporters. We even have the other Gardevoir that can draw cards and accelerate energy. The only thing we're missing is like a broken Ralt at this point. So that seems good. Of course, we compare this with other cards like Mewtwo V Union, other basic attackers. So yeah, I think Gardevoir is really good. Even though it doesn't hit for a crazy amount of damage, this thing is still, I think, a force to be reckoned with. So right now, this is probably my favorite card of the set. So we'll have to see if anything can top this. Okay, we have a Doxbun. I don't think this card is particularly great, but the ability is, you know, it's interesting. It does, I think, tie really well just thematically with Doxbun as a Pokemon. Has the Well-Baked Body ability, prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from your opponent's fire Pokemon, and this Pokemon can't be burned. So that's kind of cool. Fire Pokemon aren't that great right now, though, so as a result, this ability isn't particularly great either. But I will actually point out Grant Manley did run an Araquanid with this same sort of ability, you know, back during the XY era, and I think it actually did really well at a regional with it, if I remember correctly. Just something to keep in mind, but I definitely wanted to highlight the card just because it's a fun ability. Ties into, like I said, just the theme of Doxbun as a Pokemon. Okay, so we have a new Lucario, which I think looks okay here. So for fighting energy, just 30 plus 120 if any of your fighting Pokemon were knocked out by damage by an attack on your opponent's last turn. Even though you're probably not building around this attack, it's still pretty good. You can one-shot things like Arceus V-Star, the new Miraidon EX, and there is the other Lucario that's still in the format, the one that accelerates energy to itself. So if you are playing that card for some reason, you know, it's an okay card. Let's be fair, it's okay. If that card is more viable after rotation, I think this seems kind of natural just as a one-of potentially. So there's that. There's also the Lucario EX that's coming out that I'm sure we'll find somewhere here to look at. So this could be another card to play with that, again, just as a one-of. But it's nothing too special, but it's maybe good enough if any of the other Lucarios catch on to where you'll probably play it. Okay, we have Hawlucha, which I actually didn't expect because this was going to be a gym promo in Japan, but apparently it's in the actual set as well. But I think this card is pretty good. It says whenever you play this Pokemon from hand onto your bench, you may choose 2 of your opponent's bench Pokemon and put 1 damage counter on each of them. So yes, this is going to be our Galarian Zigzagoon replacement, since we unfortunately are losing Zigzagoon in the rotation. Now, of course, you guys can probably see some trade-offs here. The big one is that you can't target the active, but you do gain the benefit of being able to target an additional Pokemon. And honestly, I think most of the time that's going to be preferred, since especially there's ways at getting your opponent's active onto the bench with cards like Escape Rope, Boss, etc. I really don't think you mind that if it means you're getting to target an additional Pokemon. Now, unfortunately, Hawlucha can't really be spammed in the same way that Zigzagoon was, which is one of the things that made Zigzagoon so good. But I still think this card probably will see play just because there's plenty of decks that played Zigzagoon just as a one-of and didn't play things like Scoop Up Net. And we do still have the Penny supporter card that we're going to be getting, which admittedly is a lot worse than Scoop Up Net. but still does allow you some way at being able to reuse this effect. So I'm not sure if this will see nearly as much play as Zigzagoon, but I still think it's good enough to probably see some play, in some way. Okay, so we have Great Tusky X. This is going to be our first Paradox Pokemon. And I've got to say, I'm actually really surprised Paradox Pokemon didn't get their own mechanic in some way, or just something that made them a little bit different, because they are different than normal Pokemon. Nevertheless, this card is 40, discard a Stadium in play, and then for 3 fighting, this 250, and this Pokemon does 52 itself. 250 HP, admittedly, is a lot just for a basic, so that is worth highlighting. Even though we do damage ourselves, this guy does have some tank ability. I just think it's going to be difficult to get this guy powered up. Even with things like Koraidon EX and Gutsy Pickaxe, just 3 manual fightings does sort of limit how easy it is to get this thing up and running. But I guess if you do, with a choice belt, you can one-shot Giratina V-Star, you can one-shot Origin Palkia, you already do one-shot Arceus, so Lugia is going to resist you though, so that's unfortunate. I don't know, the numbers it hits for can be decent, but I just feel like this card's too clunky to keep chaining these guys throughout the course of a game. And speaking of Koraidon, we do have this guy, another card we previously saw get revealed already. But just to recap on it, its ability says once during your turn, you can attach 2 basic fighting from your discard to your basic fighting Pokemon any way that you like, but your turn does end. So this is kind of like a fighting version of Intrepid Sword. You can think of it that way, but I definitely think this is a little bit worse because this ability really isn't good beyond turn 1. We really want to start doing damage on turn 2. So on turn 1, we need to get Koraidon into play. The other fighting Pokemon we want to accelerate into play if it's not Koraidon. We need to get 2 basic fightings in discard and still find a 3rd to attach for turn. And yes, we do have cards like Ultra Ball and Research, but even with that, we're losing Quick Ball, and even if we had Quick Ball, it's still not always going to be easy to pull this off. And if you're not getting this ability off, this card just doesn't seem great as a result. Because Koraidon's attack, it's okay. 220, this Pokemon can't attack next turn. This is again, basically a fighting Zacian at this point. But 220 is just not a great number to hit for. Yeah, it's good against other basic Pokemon V and Pokemon EX. But beyond that, guys, I don't see a whole lot to really get excited about. So I think this card definitely has potential for the ability, especially because fighting Pokemon traditionally struggle with accelerating energy. So this card no doubt can help that, but I'm just not sure what really is begging for this right now. So maybe just a card to have in your binder for when the time is right. Okay, we have a Seviper. Spit poison, your opponent's active is poison. Second attack, dark in 2 colors to 60. If your opponent's active is poison, this attack is 120 more. Okay, so this damage output isn't the worst. Well, if we use double turbo, which we'll probably have to get this powered up if we're being honest. If we go dark patch, double turbo, we're actually going to be hitting for 160. If they're poisoned, that'll put them up to 170. If we have Radiant Hisui and Sneasler, that's 190. And if we have a Choice Belt, 220 against Pokemon V, right? If we use Butterfree to inflict the status conditions, they'll also be burned. So that's another 2 damage counters, but we're still, I think, just a little bit shy of the damage that we really would need for this card to be worth considering, I have to say. So this almost feels like the Donzo where, yeah, this hits for a respectable amount of damage. It's really not that hard to pull off, but it's just not quite good enough to go toe-to-toe with the decks that are actually competitive in winning tournaments. We also have a Toxicroak EX here. I'm assuming another poison-based card. This is a card we have actually not seen up until this point, so very excited to see what this guy does here. Let's see, 250 HP, fighting weakness, to retreat. So Nasty Plot, search your deck for up to 2 cards, put them into your hand, shuffle your deck. Okay, so I don't think that is great since this is on a stage 1, but the one thing I will actually shout out is that these types of attacks actually do get a good bit better after rotation since we are losing Marnie, which was one of the big things that really kept things like this from remotely being viable. Yeah, just in general, I think these effects do get better, but I think specifically on Toxicroak, I'm probably still not wanting to use this. But the second attack for a dark 2 colors does 120. Your opponent's active is poison. put 6 instead of 1 on that Pokemon between turns. Okay, so damage output wise, this is actually pretty similar to the Seviper we just saw. At least if your opponent, assuming your opponent retreats or switches. Now, if your opponent doesn't retreat, that's where things get a little bit more interesting, since you can effectively start like one-shotting things effectively if your opponent doesn't move their active. That being said, most decks are going to be just playing a card like Switch, or just going to retreat out of the status effect. So I think most of the time this attack is just going to say, hey, do 160 plus any slight damage modifiers that you might have, which is not quite good enough, I have to say. So not a huge fan of Toxicroak EX here. Okay, next up we have our first ever King Gambit card. Of course, it's going to be Bisharp's new evolution that we just saw in Scarlet and Violet. But this thing says, as long as this Pokemon is in play, the attacks of your basic Pokemon do 30 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon before applying weakness and resistance. So, you know, it's a stage 2, but I guess you can make the argument that if you're a basic attacking deck, you more than likely have the space to fit in a stage 2. And just perpetual 30 damage is kind of okay, but I almost feel like I'd rather just play Ludicolo if I'm being honest. Like, I know we're losing Scoop Up Net, so you're not going to be able to reuse Ludicolo, but doing a one-time 100 damage buff might be more impactful than just 30 damage. I mean, unless the 30 damage is all that you need to take a 2-shot to a 1-shot, unless that's the case, Ludicolo, I think more often than not, is going to be fixing your math more than this card. So I think you'd have to just treat it on a case-by-case basis on which allows you to hit the right numbers that you need to. But for the moment, I think I'd rather just play Ludicolo if I'm being honest. But not an awful card, just it's a stage 2, and there's other cards that sort of already compete with what this is trying to do. Okay, next we have up Reverum, which, fun fact, this is like one of the few new Pokemon Scarlet Violet that I actually like, which I feel like is probably a hot take since it's like an engine block Pokemon. So yeah, I feel like I'm in the minority of Reverum fans, but I still like the Pokemon. I'm actually excited to see what this card does. It says you must discard an energy from hand in order to use this ability. Once during your turn, you may draw until you have 6 cards in your hand. Okay. Then the attack 90, flip coin of heads says 90 more. Okay, so attack basically unusable, but the ability actually pretty good, I have to say. We can use this every single turn. I mean, we've already seen Greninja. People use that all the time. Discard 1 energy. I mean, it's a straight draw too. Of course, the big trade-off here is you have the potential to draw a lot more cards here if you have a low hand size. But also, this is a stage 1, which is kind of the drawback here. But, I mean, this is definitely better in certain decks than even like a Barrel some of the time. If you're playing a very energy heavy deck and you're always having energy in play to be able to pitch away, I mean, this is better than something like Barrel, and it helps lower your hand size in the process to draw more cards too. So I actually really do like this Reverum. What deck am I playing this in? I have no idea. Just straight up, I have no idea what we're playing this in. But it definitely does have some competition with the likes of Radiant Greninja and Barrel. And I don't know, maybe even the more I'm talking about it, maybe the combination of Barrel plus a Radiant Greninja is maybe just better than Reverum, if we're being honest. It's hard to say, but I do like the ability. Definitely has some promise. But who knows? That might just be hopium on my part just because I do like Reverum as a Pokemon. But cool ability. Definitely excited to see if this thing does catch on. Okay, we have Staraptor here. Card I did not expect to be taking a look at, but it actually has a cool attack for 2 colorless energy. This 60, and during your opponent's next turn, prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks of basic Pokemon. So it's kind of like an Ice Cube that you can power up for just a single attachment. Like, yes, with double turbo, you're only hitting for 40 damage, which isn't a lot, but the fact that you're walling against your opponent is the main part. The damage you're doing is almost kind of irrelevant when they can't really do anything back to you. Now, of course, Lost Box decks still play cards like Escape Rope, usually in heavy counts as well, so they might be able to get around this. It's not a card I'm expecting to do a lot immediately, but definitely has a little bit of a shot, if nothing else. And the other attack, not too bad either, 180. Discard energy, that's okay as well. But again, the first attack, definitely the reason to ever consider this. Okay, we have Oinkologne EX here. Stage 1, 260 HP. has the attack Fragrance Fury for a colorless is 10 plus 30 more damage for each of your opponent's bench Pokemon. Then 210, flip a coin of heads. This Pokemon can't attack during your next turn. Okay. Second attack, I don't really care for that much. It's okay. You might use it as a cleanup attack at some point, but I think the first one here is really the one to take notice of. So the thing that makes me like this first attack is the synergy that I think it might have with Cheryl, because this is just a single energy, doesn't matter what type. I think you can maybe even play V-Guard. That seems like maybe even one of the best ones for this potential deck. But if your opponent has, let's say, like 3 bench Pokemon in play, just as an example, you're going to be hitting for 100 damage, which doesn't seem like a lot, guys. But again, you have to remember we do have this other attack to fall back on, maybe at some point in the game too. If we're just doing a nice steady amount of damage, maybe we have Choice Belt in play, maybe we have the new Defiant Belt to maybe fix that 3-shot into a 2-shot. If we can just start spamming Cheryl turn after turn with this thing, no, that is a potential deck idea. We also don't have an ability, so we can use things like Path to the Peak as our stadium of choice. And just in general, I think there's some pretty good defensive options that we might have for this card. One to keep an eye on. I think the low damage output is really the thing that has me concerned, if anything, about this card. Okay, so getting into some of our trainer cards, as I just mentioned, Palpad is still going to be in the format, which I'm stoked on. This does, however, mean we're probably not getting a Versus Seeker reprint, which I know some people have probably been hoping for, but honestly, I'm fine having Palpad as long as we have some decent supporter recovery. I'm not too bothered by which one it is, so cool to get that. Of course, the big card you guys have probably already heard about coming back is going to be Nest Ball. So we were going to be losing Quick Ball, or I mean, I guess we still are. And up until we saw this card get reprinted, we did not know what our best way at searching out basic Pokemon was going to be. And that is definitely going to be Nest Ball. Just being able to immediately search your deck for a basic, putting it on your bench is amazing. There are definitely certain like cons compared to Quick Ball, like cards that love discard effects aren't going to like this as much. If you already have a full bench, we can't actually thin additional cards out of deck, whereas with Quick Ball you can. But nevertheless, card's still great. Definitely going to be a 4 of in almost every deck out there. Next up, getting into our Pokemon tools, which have, of course, also had a little bit of a rule change. As you may have noticed, they are no longer item cards, guys. They are their own unique card type, which definitely could impact how these cards do see play. But our first one here, Rock Chestplate. The fighting Pokemon this card is attached to takes 30 less damage from attacks from your opponent's Pokemon. So we saw a couple cards like the Great Tusk EX that definitely seems like a potential candidate for this, since it already has an insane 250 HP just as a basic Pokemon. Plus this seems pretty good. Also the Koraidon EX as well. So those definitely seem like cards that this could be good with, but I'm still not sold on those being that great. So I don't know how much play this is actually going to see immediately. We also have EXP Share getting reprinted. Probably not going to be a big change in how this card works. Let's take a look. So whenever your active is knocked out by damage from an opponent's attack, you may move 1 basic energy the card was attached to the Pokemon this card is attached to. Yeah, so same EXP share as always, but of course it is now a Pokemon tool, not an item card. And Defiant Band, another card you guys have probably already seen at this point, but if we're behind on prizes, we can do 30 extra damage to our opponent's active. So of course the big downside is that this isn't that great for like aggressive decks and decks that want to start putting on pressure immediately. But the big upside is that this works on any Pokemon, not just Pokemon V like in the case of Choice Belt. This will even work on the new Pokemon EX. So card I think is definitely good. I'm not sure what deck is going to be playing this immediately. Definitely slower decks, which I'm excited for. I'm hoping this means that more slower setup based decks will have a chance to come back in the mid to late game and go toe to toe with some of these more aggressive decks that have really just been dominating the format for so long. So cool card in my book. I like it. So we have some supporters. We have Jacques, search your deck for 2 evolution cards. We've seen this one already. Not that great. We have Team Stargrunt. This I do believe is a new one that we haven't seen though. Put an energy attached to your opponent's active on top of their deck. So this is our normal sort of like insert team of the generation grunt card of choice. They always do something like this. So, I mean, a lot of these supporters in the past have been decent. Even Team Yellgrunt, which has probably been one of the worst of all of them. This is pretty much in line with that, so probably we'll see some play. To what degree? Not sure, but it's okay. Professor's Research, of course, is getting a reprint. Same card as always, just discard your hand, draw 7. And we also have that new Penny supporter card as well. that I mentioned when we talked about, what was it, Halucha. So this will allow us to pick up one of our basic Pokemon, all cards attached to it, into our hand. So this is not scoop up net, unfortunately, but the upside is that we can at least get any cards that were attached to it, which scoop up net previously did make you discard. So I imagine we'll see play in like tanking style decks, like Great Tusk, if that ever catches on. As a more defensive deck, this could be a way at denying KOs that way. Also, still could be a card that could pop up in Lost Box decks, just because you already have a draw engine outside of your supporter with cards like Comfy and Radiant Greninja. This will potentially allow you to reuse one of those cards if you need to. So maybe this is still just going to be like a 1 of or a 2 of in Lost Box decks going forward. Hard to say. And another card we'd already seen is going to be Beach Court. It's going to be our stadium in this half of the set. Says the retreat cost of each player's basic Pokemon is 1 colorless less. So effectively, this is going to be a Sky Arrow Bridge reprint, which is great. Sky Arrow was a great card when it released. Saw play in a couple different decks, and I'm definitely expecting this to be good as well. I think the big one has got to be Lost Box. That's, I think, definitely the big deck that looks to benefit the most from something like this, since you're able to put this down and freely retreat all of your different Comfies. Of course, you can only do that once per turn, but you know, you don't need something like an Air Balloon, since Air Balloon is rotating now. Beyond that, I'm not sure what. Like, it's just a good card, just generally speaking, but you know, like if you're Mew, you're not playing this. If you're like an Arceus deck, you're not playing this. It definitely has to only help like very specific archetypes out there. But if nothing else, Lost Box is one that absolutely will be experimenting with this. All right, so getting into Violet EX, our first cards we're looking at is the Vivillon evolution line, which actually has some really good pre-evolutions, kind of like the Caterpie and Metapod that we have. These guys can both evolve immediately on the first turn when they come into play, so that is amazing. Any help that Stage 2s can get is always going to be appreciated, but let's take a look at Vivillon here. So 50, flip a coin of heads, your opponent's active is now affected by one special condition of your choosing. The pre-evolutions are definitely good, but there's no incentive to actually use them. Okay, so we have another EX that we previously didn't see. That is going to be Spidops EX. Definitely not one of my favorite Pokemon from Scarlet and Violet, but hopefully the card is decent though. So its ability says your opponent's active retreat cost is 1 more. Okay, not too bad. Grass colorless 90 plus 30 more for each damage in your opponent's active Pokemon's retreat cost. Okay. So we've seen a ton of these cards get released throughout the Sword and Shield era. None were really very good. The last card like this that was good, well, I shouldn't say that. My Lotic V actually was good for like one format. But prior to that, the Tangrowth was the last card that saw any play, but all of the other ones that we saw get released throughout Sword and Shield didn't do a whole lot here. But if we just run through the math on this, assuming our opponent has a 2 retreat cost on average, 90 plus the 30 and 30, so what? We're doing 150 right out the gate. Plus the abilities, assuming we have 2 of these in play, that's 180 to 10. So if we have 3 of these in play, that's 240. This card is like almost good. I don't think it's realistic to expect to get 4 Spidops EX in play. And if you're not taking one-shots, there's just better Pokemon that can 2-hit KO. So, I don't think this card is particularly great. And I don't think we're playing it just for this ability either. Well, I guess we have Leafeon VMAX. I actually forgot about Leafeon VMAX. So Leafeon VMAX is 60 for each energy in their retreat cost. But again, we're losing Galar Mine, so it like almost doesn't matter at that point. You're just like a worse Leafeon deck, since you have to get like 2 of these in play to replace 1 Galar Mine. Okay, so yeah, I don't think Spidops is that great. Its damage output is just a little bit below where I think it needed to be. Okay, we have Scovillain. Let's see this thing. So 20, your opponent's active is burned, so effectively 40 damage for 1. And that's other attack for Grass 2 Colorist is 90 plus 90 more if you have any fire energy attached. Okay, so you're doing 180 for 3. But I feel like this is just like a worse version of the Regidrago. It basically does the same thing, has the same attack cost, but hits for better numbers. I mean, the downside is your opponent can kind of like impact your damage output on future turns, but it's a basic as well. So yeah, I don't think we're actually playing Scovillain. Even though you can power it up with Cherim, I just don't see the incentive to play this over other stuff you can already play with that card. Okay, so we have Arcanine EX up next. Of course, this is, I think, the only other terrestrial Pokemon in the set. Of course, it doesn't take damage from attacks while on the bench because the card designers have no creativity. But nevertheless, it is a positive aspect of the card. But 2 fire does 30, plus 10 for each damage counter on this Pokemon. And then Bright Flame, 3 fire, discard 2 energy from this Pokemon for 250. So, I mean, it's fine. My issue with this card, though, is that fire doesn't have the best energy acceleration in the world for attackers that need more than 2 energy, especially for a card that has to discard energy. I'm really not a big fan of this. Like, unless we got like a welder reprint or something else that would really allow you to be able to get multiple fire energies into play, I don't think this is going to be really at this card's, I don't think this card is going to be at its potential in the short term. It's actually really similar to Reshizard, which of course was one of the best fire Pokemon of all time, but it just doesn't have the same support that that card had to be able to see play. So I think short-term wise, Arcanine seems pretty mid, I've got to say. Okay, so we have Slowbro here, which actually does have a pretty familiar ability. We've seen this before on I think it was a Dusk Noir from Flashfire, I think it was, if I remember correctly. But it says, as often as you like during your turn, you may move a damage counter from one of your Pokemon to this Pokemon. So pretty cool. What I think the big combo that this card is really screaming for is if you're some sort of basic attacking deck, or maybe even an evolution-based attacker, the big combo you can do with this is you can move the damage counters to Slowbro, and then use Cheryl to heal off any damage that's on this thing. So of course, the synergy makes sense with basic attackers, maybe like Blissey. Maybe that's a Pokemon we can think about, where you can tank hits with it, move the damage to Slowbro, Cheryl all of it off. And the reason you would still, I think, maybe use this with evolutions is going to be with like Pokemon where you don't actually want to discard the energy, where maybe if you did play Cheryl, your deck wouldn't have a way to get the energy back in play on the following turn. And Slowbro could help with that. So I actually do think this card is kind of cool. So again, big chunky basics like Bliss EV or the Great Tusk that we looked at, I think maybe you would consider something like this here. So Slowbro, maybe a card we could see pop up and see some play. Hard to say just yet, but the ability definitely has some potential here. All right, guys, we have another Pokemon we've already seen, but we'll go over it anyways here. We have Magnezone EX. So let's see. Energy Crush, 50 damage for each energy attached to all of your opponent's Pokemon. So that's definitely pretty good if you are going against some sort of energy swarming deck, like an Arceus deck. I think that's a good example. Or maybe like the Fusion Strike version of, or the Fusion Strike energy version of Mew, where they have a ton of energies in play at any given point. So this definitely seems good for those sorts of matchups. If they have 6 energy in play, I think that's really the sweet spot. Because with 6 energy, you're hitting for 300. So that one-shots Pokemon V-Star, and also puts you just a choice belt away from a one-shot on things like Mew V Max. So that's the number you would have to hit. Is it always going to happen? I don't know, but still just a single energy does mean that this card can get up and running pretty quickly, and does maybe open you up to some Cheryl shenanigans at some point too. But the second attack for 2 lightning does 220, and this Pokemon takes 30 damage. 220, it's okay. Not a bad energy to damage ratio. You can one-shot things like Origin Palkia, Lugia V-Star, etc. And between this and Energy Crush, I think it is pretty easy to play like the 2-shotting games while weaving in some Cheryls throughout the course of things as well. I mean, you still can play things like Flaffy or Electricity Generator. I think Electricity Generator is probably the more likely since it's only an item and not another evolution line you'd have to play. But Magnezone, I think this card's like really mechanically dull. So I don't think it's an interesting card, but I think it's okay. And definitely could see maybe some play here. Okay, we have Pachirisu, which is a card I actually did a short about on YouTube a couple days ago, I think at this point. And I think Pachirisu is like almost a good card. Like it's just shy. The ability is pretty irrelevant, but it does 10 plus 20 more for each of your benched lightning Pokemon. And it's not affected by weakness, which is the big Achilles heel to this card. Like if this did hit for weakness, that would actually be great, because now we would have a really easy way at taking a one-shot on different lightning weak Pokemon like Origin Palkia, Lugia, etc. Now, of course, we do still have Zeraora in the format, which is probably just better than this at this point. I mean, it still could be decent at some point, maybe once Zeraora rotates even. Because, like, let's say we're playing Miraidon EX, and we're not taking a one-shot. Well, we can maybe weave in like an attack with Pachirisu at some point to force our opponent into a 7-prize game. So like the card's not inherently awful. It's just, I think right now outclassed by Zero Aura. But at the same time, I guess this is good against like single prize decks. Much better attacker against those instead of something like a Miraidon. So there's still some hope for this card. It's just not quite as good as it almost could have been. Okay, so next up we have Rotom, which is another card that is like just shy of being a good card. And it has the Junk Hunt attack. Search your discard for an item, reveal it, and put it into your hand. Now, don't let the name of the attack confuse you. This is not as good as the old Junk Hunt Sableye because this is only a single item card compared to the 2 that you would get with the old Sableye. I know it's just a single card difference, but I do think that is going to be enough to where this card will not see play, definitely not in the same way that Sableye did. It's still okay. It's a splashable card, only attacks for colorless energy. So maybe there could be some sort of control deck at some point that might like this. But I think overall, this is a little bit weaker than I would have liked, unfortunately. Okay, we have Palmot, new stage 2 here. Says once during your turn, you may search your deck for a basic lightning energy and attach it to this Pokemon, then shuffle your deck. And then 2 lightning and a colorless does 230. Discard all energy from this Pokemon. Unfortunately, though, guys, I can't say I'm very excited for this thing. This is just going to be a worse Miraidon EX. Like, that's the big thing. Like, Miraidon hits for 10 less damage, but it doesn't discard its energy. Its ability is amazing. And it's much easier to get set up and has better damage modifiers since you can actually play Regieleki. I mean, it's kind of nice that this stage 2 is a little bit self-sufficient, but yeah, I think this is just going to be a worse Miraidon EX, which bums me out because I actually do like Palmot as a Pokemon. I think this guy's pretty cute. And of course, as I just mentioned, we are getting Miraidon EX in this set, and you guys are probably familiar with it, but nevertheless, we will recap it. Once during your turn, you may search your deck for 2 basic lightning Pokemon, put them onto your bench, then shuffle your deck, which is pretty incredible, guys. This is an amazing ability. It doesn't end your turn. You can actually chain this back to back. Like you can grab, like, let's say, just for the sake of example, a Mareep, and then a second Miraidon, and then use that Miraidon to keep chaining these different lightning Pokemon into play until your entire field is full, like on turn 1. So love the ability. And then the attack is pretty decent too. 220, can't attack during your next turn. So it's the same as Koraidon and Zacian V and stuff like that. But the big upside to this card is that it does have the help of Regieleki VMAX to increase our damage output. So with 2 Elekis in play, we're hitting for 280, and that's not even factoring in Choice Belt into the equation. Like along with Gardevoir, this is probably our best attacker I think that we've seen so far in these sets. Now, will this see play outside of its own attacking deck? Sure, maybe. Like if there's some sort of good, like single prize lightning deck out there, we could use this to help get those set up, but right now, I think the big deck that people are maybe looking at with this is Regieleki VMAX plus Miraidon. It just kind of builds itself, if we're being honest here. So definitely expecting this to be one of the cards that has a higher chance of seeing play after the set drops. Okay, we have Bayonet EX and Shuppet. And actually, we'll point out Shuppet actually does have a relevant attack here, believe it or not. So 10, flip a coin of heads, your opponent can't play item cards during their next turn. And the reason that is relevant is because Bayonet here has the Eternal Darkness attack that does 30, and your opponent can't play item cards from their hand during their next turn. So item lock is back, baby. Vikavolt is leaving us, but we do have Bayonet to replace it. However, I'm actually not sold on this being a good attack. The reason for that is Vikavolt already was really struggling to catch on and be decent for the longest time. It took basically its entire lifespan to see play. And that card's biggest issue, I think, in my book, was its low damage output, which already was an upgrade over Seismitoad EX from the XY era. But this is taking us back to only a 30 damage plus item lock. And now we're also entering into a format where items or Pokemon tool cards aren't counted as items. So we're doing less damage than ever before. We have to evolve to get into this effect, and we're locking fewer cards. It's cool that we're getting item lock, but I don't see how this is a winning strategy. We're also losing the horror psychic energy, so we're doing less damage than we would have pre-rotation. Granted, we do have Choice Belt. We do have the new Defiant Belt as well. I know a lot of people's knee-jerk reaction might be that this card is sick, but I'm not stoked on this. Poltergeist, however, is a pretty good attack that could synergize well with this and could even make Bayonet more of like less of a deck that's based around keeping your opponent locked throughout the course of a game, but maybe just locking them enough to set up some knockouts and slow them down to your pace of play. So I don't think if Bayonet sees play, it's going to be in the way that we saw a Seismitoad EX of the past, where you literally just try to keep them locked every single turn of the game. I think you're just trying to keep them locked just long enough to set up for some big attacks with Poltergeist, and maybe use cards like Crushing Hammer or Fan of Waves to sort of keep them at bay and, you know, keep their pace of play down at the pace of yours throughout the course of a game. I think that's more of how this card would work, but Bayonet's definitely cool. I'm just worried about its damage output for the moment. Next up, we have Klefki. So let's see this thing. Oh, I remember this. This card was getting translated like literally as I was going to bed. This card's insane. I actually really like this card. It says, as long as this Pokemon is your active, each player's basic Pokemon play have no abilities other than this one. And its attack just does 10. You can discard Pokemon tools. Irrelevant. The ability is really what makes this card good. And I really like this because it brings a lot of these big, fast, aggressive decks down to a screeching halt. And that makes me happy because historically my favorite decks in the format have always been the slower, more setup based decks that just want to take their time, be able to evolve over the course of a few turns, get their attackers going. And this card really does help these styles of decks because now we have answers to things like Lost Box, which have really gate kept a lot of the slower, more evolution setup based decks from being good, or a deck like MV Max, which again can have these very explosive early turns. So I love this, absolutely love this card. That being said, your opponent can still play cards like Canceling Cologne, which can get around this. But I mean, if you're forcing your opponent to have to play Canceling Cologne and, you know, cut into their consistency a little bit, that's still a net good, I think, for the format by essentially stealing away, you know, maybe 2 deck spots for some of these more aggressive decks out there. So big fan of Klefki here. Not exactly sure the exact deck it's going to be in just yet, but I could definitely see this being splashed into a number of different decks. Okay, next up we have the Houndstone evolution line. And I actually do want to give a shout out to Grievert. I really do like the card design here. So for a Psychic Energy, does 10 for each Psychic Pokemon in your discard pile. And the reason I like this is because this is kind of just like a nerfed version of the attack that's on Houndstone. And I really love, again, when basic Pokemon or pre-evolutions aren't just 1 for 10, 2 for 20, where they actually do help your core strategy in some way. And this one does that. It's kind of, you know, it's kind of the same thing as the Houndstone, but again, just a little bit weaker, which I think is really cool. And the Houndstone for 2 Psychic, which we'll come back to that in just a second, does 80 plus 10 for each Psychic in your discard pile. So 1 more energy, but you get an 80 base damage instead. But unfortunately, the 2 Psychic is what does give me a little bit of pause. Now, of course, there are things like Gardevoir EX and Shadow Rider if you did want to try to get around this a little bit, but I don't think we really want to play like multi-prize Pokemon in a deck like this. I think more than likely, if we were going to play an Energy Accelerator, it'd probably be the Gardevoir from Chilling Reign, because I imagine we're probably going to be playing the Kirlia evolution line anyways, because it's a Psychic Pokemon. It can discard Psychic Pokemon for us. So we naturally, I think, want to play a Gardevoir in there as well, maybe to help get an extra energy in play at some point. That being said, I feel like this deck is a bit of a trap. I'm definitely going to experiment with it, absolutely. But I do worry that the second energy might be a little bit too difficult to keep up with throughout the course of the game. That's my big worry. I mean, there is EXP share, there is still Raihan, but I mean, I guess there is Raihan. We do have Gallade, that's part of the Kirlia evolution line. So I don't know, the more I'm talking through it, the less of an issue the second Psychic Energy seems to be, but I can't help but wish this was just like 2 colorless energy or just a single Psychic Energy. But definitely a cool card, definitely has big vibes of the old Plasma Flareon, Vespiquen, etc. We'll definitely experiment with it, if nothing else. Alrighty, next up we have our first Annihilate, which looks absolutely sick. This card looks unreal. Great artwork on this guy. But yeah, Primeape's new evolution that we just got in Scarlet and Violet, but Let's see, for our fighting, this 70 for each prize card your opponent has already taken. Okay, so if your opponent's taken 5, that's 350. That's actually pretty good. Not gonna lie, that's gonna one-shot pretty much anything that you're gonna go up against. I mean, and really, even once they've taken their second, you're still two-shotting things. But to stage 2, guys, it's contingent upon your opponent beating you to do more damage. So it's probably not gonna be competitive, but it's an okay card though. Card looks sick if nothing else though. Okay, so we have Mabostiff, which looks absolutely insane. This is some ridiculous looking artwork. In the games, he looks like so much more chill, but here he's like absolutely unhinged looking. Anyways, stage 1 Pokemon, let's see what it does. Once during your turn, you may switch your opponent's active with one of their bench Pokemon. Oh, but your opponent chooses the Pokemon to bring active. Okay, so this is like Repel or Escape Rope or something like that. This ability was almost incredible, but yeah, I think they probably had to reel this one in just a little bit here. It's still an okay ability, but I feel like most decks rather just play an Escape Rope. I mean, there's definitely going to be times where this is good, but this is a stage 1, guys. This is going to inherently be clunky to get set up, especially if you're just playing a 1/1. It's not always going to be easy to get the setup whenever you want it to. So I don't think the ability is good enough, unfortunately. And the attack, it's okay, but again, we're not going to build around Mabostiff here. I just don't think we're going to. So card is probably just a notch or 2 below where it needs to be. Okay, and we have our other Paradox Pokemon. We have Iron Treads EX over here. We did see this one before, and I do remember it being kind of mid. Yeah, it's got triple laser, 30 to 3 of your opponent's Pokemon, and then 160 for an insane 3 metal and a colorless. Switch this with one of your benched Pokemon. So I will say, if you can work up to building up this attack, you can switch into Diancie to prevent things like Boss's Orders from bringing this back up. So that seems kind of cool. One of the big issues with some of these different like switching, like hit and run style Pokemon that we have right now, like the Mian Xiao, just as an example, is that they don't really hit for quite enough. And this does, but without Metal Saucer, this is like, I don't even know how you're powering this up. I guess the stage 2 Magnezone, but that seems kind of like a losing strategy. I'm not going to lie to you guys. So yeah, I can't say I'm a big fan of this Pokemon. Okay, we actually have a surprisingly interesting Squavit. So Squavit says, once during your turn, you may shuffle your hand and return the cards to the bottom of your deck without looking at them, then draw a single card. So you're like Marnieing yourself into 1, essentially. You can think of it that way, which seems kind of bad, but I think I'd still rather play this over like any other Squavit, just because if you already have like a 1-card hand or like a 2-card hand, and it's not what you want, you may as well just dig 1 card deeper at that point. Or if you have like a draw engine with something like a Barrel or a Radiant Greninja, or let's say you're actually going to take a knockout on the same turn and you're going to get 2 or 3 prizes anyways, you might still do this just to try to see an extra card. I could see that, like, especially if you don't need the cards in your hand. So this card's like surprisingly interesting. Let's say you have like a massive hand. You put it at the bottom of your deck, and then you use something like Gallade to search out a research, and then just discard a single card instead of like maybe 5 or 6 that you would have had to. So there's interesting things that we can do with this. And it's a very splashable card, being level ball searchable, just a basic. So yeah, I'm curious to see if anything comes with this card, but it is neat if nothing else. Okay, we have Mousehold. Let's see. Okay. This is interesting. It says family attack. This is 70 for each of your Mousehold in play. So guys, if we have all 4 Mousehold in play, we're going to be hitting for 280, well, 260 once we factor in the damage reduction from Double Turbo. That's actually pretty cool. And the reason I do like this too is because Rescue Carrier actually gets back the entire evolution line, because this thing only has 70 HP. So if you're playing like 4 Rescue Carrier, and even Zoroark if you really want to, it's actually going to be like insanely easy to keep chaining these attacks. Like, I feel like Lost Box just eats this deck for breakfast, which is fine. You have to take an L somewhere, but yeah, this definitely has my interest, despite me hating this Pokemon. Like, I absolutely detest this evolution line, just like their designs, but this card is pretty cool. I think the other issue you have to sort of overcome is the double energy attack cost, because unfortunately we are losing twin energy in the rotation, and you need something else beyond your 4 double turbos. So you might need to play something like, I don't know, Frostlass, the one that accelerates a single water from discard. There's got to be something else I'm just forgetting right now, but I'm intrigued by what I'm seeing, if nothing else. Alrighty, getting into our trainer cards for this half of the set. Says, look at the top 5 cards of your deck, choose 2 basic lightning energy, and attach them to your bench lightning Pokemon, anybody you like, then shuffle the remaining cards into your deck. So again, guys, I would assume everyone's caught up on this one. It saw a lot of talk when it got revealed, but it's kind of like a slightly different version of Max Elixir. Like, you don't get to look at quite as many cards, but you get 2 energy as opposed to the one that Max Elixir used to give. So this seems like a natural partner for your lightning based decks out there. Flappy's pretty decent, but you know, let's be real, guys. Flappy's going to take up potentially like 8 spots in your deck if you're playing a 4/4 line. And if you're just playing 4 of these, you suddenly gain a little bit of extra space to work with, and it's easier to play. You can play this as soon as turn 1 and maybe have some big explosive turns. Seems really good with the likes of things like Maridon EX. Action CB are keeping Ultra Ball, which we already knew was going to stay through rotation either way. We have Picnic Basket, which says, heal 30 damage from all Pokemon in play, both yours and your opponent's. Now, I actually don't think healing your opponents is actually that bad. Because let's say you're a deck that's taking 1-hit KOs anyways, the heal is irrelevant. Or let's say you're a 2-shotting deck, but you do so much damage that a 30 heal doesn't change a 2-shot to a 3-shot. So I actually think this is almost strictly better than Potion in most decks out there. So I actually kind of like Picnic Basket. I mean, what deck will play this? I mean, I don't even know. Maybe something like Hisumi and Gudra, if that still winds up being decent after rotation. I'm not sure, but yeah, I think this is actually kind of a decent healing card. I think this card is a little bit better than it might seem at first glance. We have a Rocky Helmet reprint. Nothing's really changed too much with that. Getting into some supporters, we have Katie. Okay, so using this card ends your turn. Well, that's not good. Then shuffle your hand into your deck and draw 8. Okay, so shuffle and draw 8 is great, but after turn 1, this card is just terrible. So yeah, I think this is a really bad card. We have Arven, another card we already saw, but just as a refresher, search your deck for an item and Pokemon tool, reveal them, put them into your hand. You don't get to see a ton of cards with something like Professor's Research does, but nevertheless, being able to search out exactly what you want can still be good. Kind of reminds me of a slightly better version of Skyla. I could definitely see this catching on in certain decks out there. Maybe even something like UV Max could be good because you can guarantee your Battle VIP pass, plus a Choice Belt or your Forest Seal Stone, or even in the mid game, just being able to grab like a Choice Belt plus a Power Tablets could be good. And you have your Genesects to sort of offset the lack of draw power from a supporter like this. So we'll have to see, but card seems okay. Okay, and our last supporter here, we have Miriam. So you choose 5 Pokemon cards in your discard pile, reveal them, shuffle them into your deck. Oh, but you do draw 3 cards. All right, so one thing we are going to be sorely lacking after the rotation is some sort of item-based Pokemon recovery like Super Rod, Ordinary Rod, or Rescue Stretcher. Like, really the only thing we have is Rescue Carrier, and that's just not enough for most decks. And being a supporter, like supporter-based recovery usually isn't that good just because it's so slow. The issue is you shuffle the cards back in, but because you've already played your supporter, it's hard to sometimes find them after you put them back into your deck. But I'm really glad they at least designed this card to allow you a way to maybe draw back into those cards. The draw 3 is, I think, actually really good about this. Now, we can't get basic energies with this, and it's still a supporter, which I can't underscore is such a bummer. But nevertheless, we do have some sort of Pokemon recovery for after rotation, and at least is better than other things in the past, like Brock's Grit or like Flower Shop Lady and stuff like that. So I'm at least happy they gave it some sort of draw effect, but I do still worry that this card might be a little bit slower than I would like for some of these different evolution-based decks out there that are going to want some sort of good Pokemon recovery. But we'll see. But Either way, at least we have some sort of recovery option for after the rotation happens now. And for our last stadium card here, we have Mesa Goza. So it says, once during each player's turn, that player may flip a coin of heads, search their deck for a Pokemon, review it, put it into your hand, then they shuffle their deck. Okay, so this is just Pokeball on a stadium, which at a glance I think seems kind of bad, but I feel like I actually like this card. Because unlike Pokeball, you can get repeated uses out of it. Like if this stays in play for 2 or 3 turns, just being able to grab maybe 1 or 2 Pokemon extra throughout the course of a game is huge. And also, it's Pokeball that can bump your opponent's Temple of Sinnoh, their Path to the Peak. So even if you're flipping tails, it still serves a purpose by acting as a counter stadium. And we sometimes see from time to time, there's going to be decks out there that need a counter stadium to have answers to things like Path to the Peak. And a lot of times they don't have something that really jives well with their deck. And this is just a good generic sort of stadium that really any deck can play that can act as a counter stadium in these instances. So even though your opponent definitely can get good use out of this as well, I think this card actually could see some play. I do like this card. So that's going to be it for the core Scarlet and Violet sets, but there are still some starter decks that Pokebeach has also translated that does have some other new cards that we're going to take a look at. Most of these cards honestly are not going to be very good. Just a heads up, most of these starter deck cards they're usually a little bit more basic. They're more mechanically uninteresting. Again, they're starter deck cards just to try to get people introduced into the game. So I'm not sure how many of these are actually going to be good. I'm willing to bet very few. We have Meowscarada here. 40, put energy attached to your opponent's active into their hand. Bad. See, this is what I'm talking about here. We have Lucario EX. Card we already did see, but just a refresher on it. Low kick to 60, then Aura Sphere does 160, and does 50 to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. So this attack, actually, I don't think is that bad. The big issue, of course, is the energy cost. So you would have to use something like a Koraidon EX, and or something like Gutsy Pickaxe if you do want to have a shot at powering up these Lucarios. But 160 plus a 50 snipe is pretty good. Very similar to the Inteleon VMAX we saw back from Rebel Clash, which was a card that actually did see a little bit of play for a while there. I think this is okay. Nothing great though. Okay, but we do have some trainer cards, which are probably going to be the more important that we're seeing here. So we have Energy Switch reprint, as expected. Energy Search, we already knew about this one. Potion reprint, as expected. Pokegear. Okay, now this is actually an important card because this was one I don't think had confirmation would be returning for Scarlet and Violet. So this is a huge get here. So same effect as always. Look at the top 7, get a supporter. But hey, it's a really big card there. We have the new Switch artwork, which I think actually looks pretty dope. I actually really like the way this looks. Pokemon Catcher, we knew that was staying. Judge, okay, a reprint of Judge, but Judge was going to stay either way. We have Youngster. Okay. So this is literally just Shauna. Same exact effect. But I guess the takeaway is that Youngster is one of these characters in the games that appears in every generation. So the fact that this effect is now on this character means that we could have a shuffle and draw 5 come back theoretically really in any generation of the TCG that didn't have Shauna as a relevant character, in the other games media at the time, if that makes any sense at all. But card is still mediocre, but we are losing Marnie, and we really don't have many other good supporter card draw supporters. So this might be one of the few tertiary supporters that could be looking at. I mean, we still have Shauna either way, but yeah, either way, the effect is going to be sticking around for a while. Okay, Nemona and Research, nothing special there. Okay, we have our first Skeledirge. Let's see this thing. Card looks kind of cool. Artwork's okay. Let's see, Fiery Vocals, 50, attach up to 2 basic energies from your discard. 2 Pokemon A with you like, nothing special. Then 190 does 32 itself. Okay, we have Ampharos EX. Another card we already kind of knew about, but let's recap it. I do admittedly kind of forget what it did here. So 60 for 1, and then Lightning 2 colors, 140, you may discard 2 energy, does 100 more. Okay, so this is actually a pretty good effect, given that Ampharos evolves from the Flaffy from Evolving Skies, because you already want to play a 4/4 Flappy anyways in your decks. And now you have a card that you can evolve into to do some damage in the process. Now, unfortunately, your damage output, I think, is a little bit shy of where you want it to be, because even if you discard the energy with a choice belt, you're only hitting 270, which isn't knocking out most of the V-Stars. I think I like Magnezone better out of these Stage 2 EXs that we've looked at in this First Impressions video. But it's an okay card. It gives you something you can evolve your Flappy into. So if nothing else, if some sort of Flappy based deck does wind up being good at some point, it's not unrealistic to expect Ampharos to be a one of. And as you would expect, it looks like we do have a Quaquaval. I think that's how you pronounce this guy's name. But says once during your turn, you may attach a basic energy from hand to one of your Pokemon. Okay, so it's actually probably better than the other starter evolutions we've seen, but it's a stage 2, which I think is the Achilles heel to this card. If this was a stage 1, or if it was like attached 2 energies, if it had been either of those things, I'd be more interested in entertaining actually playing this card. But I think this is probably just a little bit too weak of an effect for its stage that it is. We have Mimikyu EX, again, another card we already knew about. We saw this guy back at Worlds as well. So Void Return 30, you may switch this with one of your bench Pokemon. And then Energy Burst, 30 for each energy attached to both active Pokemon. Nothing special. So, okay, we have Energy Retrieval, another card we hadn't seen. So we kind of knew Retrieval was going to stick around. It always does. Oh, we actually have Vitality Band. Was not expecting this. So it's the same as it has been, just 10 more damage. Now, Vitality Band really hasn't been good in a very long time. It saw a little bit of play when Sword and Shield first dropped. Like, if I remember right, what was it? I think there were some ADP lists, I want to say, that were trying to play Vitality Band. It's been a while, I forget, but this card did see very fringe play when it first dropped. But yeah, this thing is not Choice Belt. This is not as good. But again, as we get more and more away from Pokemon V, V-Star, etc., cards like this and the new Defiant Band are going to be a little bit better, since there will be less Pokemon V in the format, or less relevant Pokemon V, I should say, to actually use Choice Belt against. So long term, this could be good. And that's going to be it, guys. We looked at, man, a ton of cards. In terms of what I think about everything we looked at, I think there were, given the amount of cards that we did look at, I think there was a disproportionate lack of good cards. That being said, there are still some great ones. I think Gardevoir, Miraidon, Klefki, I think it was. Some of the trainer cards like Electricity Generator. We did see a lot of definitely playable cards, but some things I wasn't too stoked on. I think the Terrestrial mechanic just in general is really underwhelming. And again, I'm really curious what you guys think of the mechanic and how it's being handled going forward. Same thing with the Paradox Pokemon. So far, they're really mechanically uninteresting, which was a little bit unexpected. I actually think, ironically, the most interesting thing about Scarlet and Violet is all of the changes coming to the actual like sealed products that are going to be in stores, and how like we're getting like the silver border cards. We've seen more interesting changes where it doesn't really matter as much, if that makes any sense. But nevertheless, I'm really excited for this new generation. You know, between the post-rotation format and the reintroduction of Pokemon EX coming back into the game, I really think things are going to be shaken up a good bit, and I'm really excited to see how this new generation is going to pan out. But of course, guys, these were largely just my first impressions, and I will be doing a much more in-depth full set review once we get a little bit closer to this set's release. But if nothing else, until then, let me know down below in the comment section, what do you guys think about all of these new cards today? What were your favorites that we saw get revealed? If you enjoyed today's content, remember to leave a like on the video, and if you're feeling a little bit extra generous and want to take that support to the next level, you can also become a patron or pick up some rare candy merch. I'll have links to those down below in the description. But as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.